So we've got a lot to talk about, but we're going to talk about Buffalo because that's the latest thing in the news. And there's a number of things we can talk about. We can talk about what happened. We can talk about the officers, their conduct, but we also want to talk about the First Amendment and any possible implications for that. And Dan, before we started recording, you were talking about the 52 or 53 officers in Buffalo. So to set this up, everybody's seen the video by now. It's a 75-year-old man approached some police officers. One of the things that we might want to talk about later, because in our pre-recording conversation, we didn't hit this, is the militarization of police forces. I mean, that seems to me to be the root problem of all of this, is that our police forces now look like stormtroopers instead of community police. But police were advancing on something or other. They were approached by an elderly, what the media has identified as an activist in the community. There was a shove or a push, or at least contact of some kind. Something happened. The gentleman toppled over backwards, hit his head on the pavement, started bleeding out of an ear. It was pretty disturbing scene, obviously. But after the two officers who were involved in that were suspended, was it 52, 53 other officers?
53 other officers resigned from this special policing unit as an act of solidarity. That's the way I've seen it described, with the two officers who were suspended. So the question that is of interest to me is what might be the response of the Buffalo PD or the Buffalo City Council to this expressive conduct. I think it clearly was intended to be expressive conduct by the 52 or 53 officers. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that higher authorities in Buffalo take some sort of work-related action against these 52 or 53 officers. For example, let's say, okay, they decide that they're going to suspend these officers with or without pay and put them through some sort of process that is due under the collective bargaining agreement, and that there may or may not be further employment-related action taken against them. I would expect that as part of this process, the officers are going to assert a First Amendment right to engage in free speech or expressive conduct, and that leaves us squarely at the precedent called Garcetti against Ceballos, which we can talk about if that's something that's interesting to you guys.
Yeah, and so Jeff Swartz is here. I should have done introductions. Dan Ray, Jeff Swartz, people know who we are. But Jeff, you were, it sounds like, had some thoughts about, first of all, whether it is expressive. And I guess that's an interesting question, right? Expressive conduct, the test for that is message intended, message received. So is it expressive conduct? And you also had some thoughts about how the police department or the city would handle it.
Well, my first thought process is that part of, and what Dan mentioned, was we don't know what the collective bargaining agreement calls for and what they can and cannot take action against. The real problem that you're going to run into if the department tries to take action against these 52 simply because they have chosen to resign from a unit which is clearly voluntary, a unit for which they may look back and say, we've allowed numerous other people to resign. Why aren't you letting us resign? And that's going to be a serious problem, because now are they being discriminated against because they have chosen not to be part of the unit because they are supportive of someone, not because they're speaking out, but because they don't feel that they can rightfully stay on a unit where they don't believe that they're receiving the proper treatment or being respected the way that they want to be respected as members of that unit. Part of the problem may fall upon what actually happened, whether in fact the initial suspensions were proper. That being that if in fact this activist, as he's been described, made physical contact with voluntarily made physical contact with a police officer who was engaged in a particular action for which they are taking special protective measures because of the danger that's included in it, and it touches him in such a way as that inadvertently this gentleman loses his balance and falls down, then choose not to break ranks to take care of him and allow the EMTs that were directly behind them walk in 15 seconds later to give this gentleman treatment is being exaggerated because of the situation that we find ourselves nationally. So the question now comes in as to whether, in fact, they have the right to resign without retribution. If you voluntarily get in, why can you not voluntarily resign without retribution? And if that retribution is violative of the collective bargaining agreement, they don't have to go to the First Amendment, and it won't. And if I were their lawyer, I'd say, don't go there just because of Garcetti. Let's fight it on other grounds.
If Garcetti does come into play, Dan, why don't you explain what that, how that works?
Sure. Garcetti against Sabalos is well, it's now been on the books for several years. It's an opinion that was written by former Justice Tony Kennedy. And the facts involved a local Los Angeles district attorney prosecutor who was reprimanded, had adverse job-related action taken against him because he wrote a memorandum that his supervisors in the prosecutor's office took exception to. They disagreed with his opinions, and so they took retaliatory action against him. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and Garcetti said this was an act of expression on my part, and because it's a matter of public concern, it's protected by the First Amendment. And the court flatly cut that argument off and said, no, no, no. If you are a public employee and you engage in speech or expressive activity on matters related to your job duties, that expressive activity is not protected First Amendment activity, period, full stop. And so I guess where that sort of takes us under these circumstances is, I don't know that it really matters in terms of the actions or the arguments that the police officers themselves might make here. If I'm the Buffalo Police Department or the Buffalo City Council, and we want to take some sort of adverse job-related action against these officers, setting aside what the collective bargaining agreement might say, and I'm willing to assume, Jeff, that there is some process that the collective bargaining agreement requires that the city or the PD would follow. But the ultimate argument by the city or the PD is going to be, you engaged in speech or expressive conduct that is within the scope of your job duties as members of this special police unit or as members of the police department more generally, and therefore it's not protected under the First Amendment. So we are within our constitutional power to take retaliatory action against you for it.
And my response, again, if I were representing the police officers, would simply be that this is a voluntary duty, that they have the right to enter into if accepted, and they have the right to exclude themselves if they choose, because it is voluntary. And if it is voluntary, choosing to abandon a voluntary duty is different than, say, doing something that is deemed to be an expression, First Amendment expression that of something they want to say, by all of them choosing to take that action. I know that one can argue that acting as a group, that is an expression, okay, of a statement. However, those officers may choose to say that we chose to leave because we no longer want to be associated with this particular duty for which we have no requirement to participate. And the fact that it is not a duty that when we joined the police department, we were required to do, or that was within the scope of our duties, This is saying this is a duty I have the right to say no to. I did not do it in the midst of my duty. I did not comment on how the duty is performed. I'm commenting on the fact, or if you want to call it a comment, I am choosing to disassociate myself, which I think they have the right to do, whether it's under contract or even under Garcetti. Garcetti made a point of saying, this was my expression. I have the right to make an expression. They said, no, you don't. I think these people are saying, we weren't making an expression. We chose to no longer be associated, which we had, and others have exercised the right to do, no longer be involved.
Yeah, and I think
I'm sorry, go ahead, Brendan.
well, no, I was just going to say, it seems like if there's a point of agreement, it's that the threshold question is whether the First Amendment is in play at all, and that turns on the question whether what these officers are doing or what they will do. Who knows what's coming next, right? Do they start talking to the newspaper? Do they start making public statements? But is what they've done already, is that expressive? If it is expressive, if it is expressive conduct, then it would be speech. If it's not expressive conduct, then it would not be speech. But if it is speech, there's no protection for that speech under Garcetti. Dan, is that where you were going, Dan? Did I just?
Yeah, I think that's a fair premise to start from. And then, obviously we get into all sorts of questions, like if this wasn't intended as an expressive act, then what was it for? I also think that it's possible, as Jeff points out, it may be that this court, you never know what this court's going to do. We always have to throw that caveat into any discussion like this that we have. I suppose it's possible that this court might carve out a voluntary assumption of duties exception. And I think that opens up a huge can of worms that I'm not sure the court wants to open up, that would cause all sorts of problems in interpretation for lower courts. And then the third question is whether it matters at all. If I'm the Buffalo PD or the Buffalo City Council, I say, look, we can go back and forth all day long about whether this was something that was undertaken voluntarily as a member of this unit, or whether it was something that was part of your larger job duties as a police officer. But either way, the fact is that it was within the scope of your duties, voluntary or otherwise, and therefore there's no First Amendment protection. So fascinating question. Some open questions, obviously, that would have to be resolved. But it's one of those kinds of things that I think bears watching.
That's great. All right. Well, we definitely run the clock here. So thanks, both of you. And we'll have to do this more often. And we should fight more. It'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know me, Mr. Contrarian, so it's okay.
Jeff Schwartz is what I call a gratuitous contrarian. He will disagree with you just because he can.
That's what judges are supposed to do, isn't it?
Okay, I'm like the police officers in Buffalo. I'll find any reason whatsoever. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. All right. We'll see you for the next one.
Have a good day, boys.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Got an audio problem.
Yeah, we do have an audio. Thank you.
Every time you talk to your what it's gonna do. Dog is out of control. Your microphone's not working. You just post this shit show. This would get a lot of views.
Three
Now,
farts in a microphone.
better now.
It's better.
Yeah, who's on first? I don't know. Third base. Okay.
No idea. This is an ongoing problem.